All right, today we're going to learn how to thread, operate, and maintain a serger. So just like a sewing machine, the serger sews a seam, but it also does a lot of other things besides just doing that, all in one step. So while it's sewing the seam, it also cuts off any excess fabric that you might have on the edge, which also finishes the edge. There are also a lot of parts on the serger that are similar or the same as a sewing machine. You have your presser foot here. You have tension dials here. You also have our stitch length dial and a hand wheel, and of course our power button. Some things that are a little bit different from a sewing machine, however, we have 2 needles instead of 1. Sometimes you can take off one of the needles, but usually there are 2. We also have 2 things called loopers. I'll show you them when we open up our machine in a minute. But they are the ones that pull the thread over to the other side and create that kind of looping on a serged piece of fabric. The other 2 things that we have that I wanted to talk about are knives. We've got some knives underneath this right here, this little catch. There are a couple knives down there that cut off the edge of your fabric as you're sewing. So you want to make sure that you have anything past this line is going to be cut off by your serger. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The other thing that we have is our fabric catcher or lint catcher. It sits here and it catches any of the fabric that falls off the edge of your fabric while you are sewing after the knives cut it. So it's very important to have this on your machine as you are sewing. However, when we are threading our machine, it does need to come off. So I'm going to just pull it off gently and put it to the side. The next thing we want to do is we want to lift up our presser foot. This is so that we can get underneath it and make sure all our threads are coming out to the side. We then want to open up our machine here by pulling to the right and then tipping it down. Inside of here we have a lot of great tools. We have a little brush that we can sweep away any lint or fuzz that gets underneath or excess threads so that it doesn't gunk up our machine or anything. We also have our needles, excess needles, and a screwdriver to help us put those in and out. And some other tools that you probably won't need to use on a regular basis, but if you ever do, we can talk about those in class. Just get those back in place. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to open up the rest of our machine. It'll make it a lot easier to get into these tiny spots here. So we just take that lever, pull it down, and just open up that side. This is where all the gears and levers are for the machine, but this is what we want to look at. This is what we're going to be threading today. It does look a little scary, but it is very easy to do once you've learned how to do it. So this is a great tool to utilize when you're learning how to thread a machine. It tells you exactly where the thread is going to go and which thread goes where. So on a normal project, you're going to be using one color of thread, one matching thread for your project. So for today, we're going to be using 4 different colors so that you can clearly see which thread is going where and how you're supposed to thread it. So there is a very specific order to this, and we do need to follow it specifically so that it is threaded correctly. We also need to use our tweezers. This will ensure that we can get into these tiny spaces down here without having to use our fingers that can sometimes get in the way. So we're going to start off with our blue thread. This is our lower looper thread. It's important we start here and always here. So we have our blue thread here on the spool. It's going to go up through this thread guide and then down here through this thread guide. Just want to make sure that it is in place. Down here through our tension discs, which hold our thread at the correct tension. down here through another thread guide there. We're gonna follow, you see all these blue dots? You're gonna follow the blue dots. There are green dots and blue dots. So through this little pigtail, make sure it is all the way in there, not halfway in. We're next gonna go through, we're gonna pull this over here just a bit so we can see this. So there's another blue. We're gonna go through there. Make sure it gets all the way in there. And then all the way over to this one here. And again, making sure it does catch, or else you're gonna have lots of loose threads everywhere. Then we're gonna come over here. I'm gonna use the hand wheel to pull this. Oh, and here are our loopers. Let's talk about those. So these are our loopers here. There's our lower looper and our upper looper. They are called that because one is lower and one is higher. So that's easy to remember. They are they're the mechanism that pulls the thread across the fabric and creates kind of that zigzag look across the fabric. So we're gonna thread it through just like we would our needles. Using the tweezers can help to get in those very close areas. We're gonna pull that thread up and then just pull it off to the side, to the left side, just like we would our sewing machine. I wanna keep a nice tail just so that I don't have to worry about threading any of that again, since we took all that time. All right, next we're gonna take our green thread. It is our upper looper thread. We're gonna pull it down just like we did with the blue, through this stitch guide, making sure it catches, down through the tension disc, down here through the left thread guide, and then over here to this first green dot, making sure this catches through the hole, up behind this, another green dot there. Here's a little pigtail. We want to make sure that we catch our green thread back behind that. Make sure it catches into the hole. We're then going to move our looper so that we can see it better. All right. So now we've got a nice spot where our hole is there. We're going to thread it through just like a needle again. Pulling it out under our presser foot and to the left, pulling a nice long tail. So now we have two of our threads already threaded, not too bad. Next, we're gonna go for our yellow thread. This one doesn't have a stitch guide back here, so we're just gonna pull it through here down to this stitch guide. This tension wheel, you need to go around clockwise. So from the right around like that. So just right along like that. Make sure it is pulled tight in there. You'll feel the tension in it. We're gonna take it down to these thread guides here. I'm gonna go underneath that one and above these two. We then are going to thread our needles. So we need to raise our needles here. We have a little thread guide back here. We want to go through that. And since this is our right needle thread, we are going to thread the right needle. And so we take our tweezers right like this. Let's see, I'm going to cut that thread so we have a nice sharp edge to use. If you're having trouble, that can sometimes help. Just cutting off that edge. All right, so just gonna thread it right through that hole and out again, pulling that thread underneath our presser foot again over to the left with our other two threads. So we now have 3 threads, 1 left. So final, we have our red thread. Make sure we're always getting it through these thread guides up here. We're going to go through this red left needle thread guide around the right hand side of this tension disc and down, making sure that that catches. We then want to go the exact same place we went with this yellow. So down below that stitch guide and up above those two. This time, instead of going through the right one, we're going to go to the left stitch or thread guide down here. And then we want to go to our left needle here. So again, taking our tweezers can help immensely. May take a couple tries. All right, there we go. And then again, under our presser foot, very important, and out to the left. Okay, we now have 4 threads out here that are all threaded, hopefully correctly. So we're gonna close this just by gently pushing it back into place until it clicks. We always wanna keep our tweezers up on the stitch guide up there so that we don't lose them. We're gonna then pull this up and it should just snap right into place on its own. We're then going to replace our thread catcher or fabric catcher so that we have something to catch all of our excess material. All right, the next thing we wanna do before we start sewing, which is a little bit different with the serger as opposed to the sewing machine, is we're gonna lower our presser foot just with the same lever like you would in a sewing machine. We're then going to take our piece of fabric and we are going to sew a seam. We want to make sure as we're sewing that we know that anything past this line is going to get cut off. So anything past this stitch plate right here is going to be cut off by the knife. So we don't want to have all of our thread all the way over here because we're going to cut off all of that fabric. We want to just be right on that edge where we want to sew. So instead of putting our fabric underneath the presser foot, you can start right out here and you're just going to use foot pedal. When you're finished, instead of stopping right when the fabric gets to those needles, you're going to just continue sewing. And you're going to sew until the end of your fabric comes to the edge of your serger right there. And then you can just cut that off with your scissors. And you should have a nice clean line of stitching. If your tension has been done correctly, you will have on the top of your fabric 2 rows of red and yellow, our needle threads. You have your upper looper, which is our green, which is on the top of the fabric, and our lower looper on the bottom. If your stitching tension is correct, that green and blue, our upper and lower loopers, should meet just right on the edge of our fabric. It shouldn't be coming over onto the top or on the bottom. However, if they are, it's easy to fix with our tension dials. That's what they're for. So I want you to remember higher means tighter and lower means looser. So if you need your thread to be tighter, you want to just raise it up higher to a higher number. And it goes all the way up. If it needs to be looser, then you just want to lower it down. And that's about as easy as it can get. So I always suggest trying it on a scrap of fabric before you serge. That way you know if your tension is correct or if you need to adjust before you sew on your actual garment. So now we've got a nice line of stitching. We want to talk about what we should and shouldn't do with our serger. One very important thing is we leave our presser foot down. The only time we're going to raise it is when we are threading our machine. Another important thing that we want to make sure we don't do, we don't want to serge over any pins. Because we have this needle, we don't want to serge over any pins. We don't want to cut off any metal with our knives. That dulls the knives, it can break the machine. No pins on the serger. We also don't want to use the serger for any zippers or too much bulk. It can only handle so much and we don't want to break them. So Remember those rules before you use the serger. The last thing I want to talk about is one other way that you can thread your machine. So I'm going to show you how to do it, but we won't thread the whole thing. So if we wanted to change this color, all we'd have to do is we want to start with the same order that we started before. What you're going to do is you're just going to cut it up here like that. You're going to tie on your next color of thread, say white or black or whatever you're using for your project. You're going to tie a square knot. So we're going to go left over right, and then right over left. Just creating a nice solid knot that won't come out easily. Oh, I might have gotten a loop. Nope, we're good. Okay, after that we want to kind of trim our thread so we don't have too much excess there. All right, so just a little bit down there. So we just have a few tails, but not too bad. From there, we're going to do the same thing to each of these. After we've done that, we can lift up our presser foot and gently, we will just pull our loopers down until we get to that knot. When you see that knot, that means that your change of thread has happened, and you can just snip it and be done with those. Our needles, we do have to change on their own, just like we did the first time. So just threading it through these stitch guides, around the dials, down and through our 2 needles. So depending on what you need, those are the 2 ways that you can thread a machine. We want to make sure that we remember all of our rules, and the serger can be a great tool that we can utilize in our sewing.